The smell came first. Hot iron, fried eggs, coffee, real coffee, not the bitter barley substitute they'd been drinking for years. For a moment, the column of German prisoners froze in the Texas sun, unsure if it was a dream or a trick. It was July 1944. The war still burned across Europe, but here, near the small town of Hearne, Texas, the only sounds were cicadas, boots on dust, and the distant hiss of bacon fat curling in a pan. Sergeant Klaus Meyer stood in line, his face drawn thin from months of retreat and surrender. 27 years old, former tank commander of the 2nd Panzer Division. He had seen Stalingrad from the edge, Normandy from inside the smoke. He expected humiliation, maybe a beating, maybe nothing at all, but certainly not breakfast. A young American private with sandy hair and a nervous smile ladled 2 fried eggs onto a metal plate and handed it to him. "Eat up," he said. Klaus didn't move. The eggs steamed in front of him, yellow centers trembling in the heat. One of the guards barked, "Move it along, Kraut." He sat on the ground, still holding the plate. Around him, other prisoners stared as if afraid to touch their food. One of them whispered, "It's too hot. They're mocking us." Klaus leaned closer, smelled the butter, and quietly replied, "No, they cooked it right." He took the first bite, slow and suspicious, and then another. The warmth hit his chest like memory. The others began to eat too, clinking spoons against tin, breaking the morning silence with small sounds of disbelief. Private Joe Latham, the cook, watched from the mess tent, wiping his hands on a towel. He was 21, from Kansas, and had never seen a German before. To him, they looked like scarecrows in uniforms, sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, still holding the posture of men expecting orders that would never come. One of the American sergeants muttered, "Why the hell are we feeding him eggs? Thought prisoners got oatmeal." Another shrugged. "Army says everyone eats breakfast, even the enemy. That's the rule." Latham didn't answer. He just kept pouring coffee into metal mugs, one after another, until his arms started to ache. The Germans drank in silence. The smell of grease and bread mixed with the dry, sweet scent of Texas dust. Overhead, a buzzard turned lazy circles against a white sky. After months of fighting for survival, the stillness felt unreal, like standing inside someone else's life. Klaus set his fork down. "If this is victory," he said to the man beside him, "it smells like mercy." That line would later appear in a translated letter, part of an Army archive labeled POW Correspondence, Camp Hearne, July 1944. But that morning, it was just a whisper, carried off by the wind across the wire. Later that day, the prisoners were led through the camp, rows of barracks, fences, guard towers. To their surprise, it was clean, almost orderly. There was a hospital tent, a baseball diamond, even a chapel. On one wall, painted in neat English letters, discipline, work, respect. Klaus stared at the word respect. He wasn't sure whether it was meant for them or for the men with rifles standing above. Inside the mess tent, Latham scrubbed the pans. He didn't know why the smell of those eggs lingered in his nose. Something about the way the Germans had eaten, quietly, almost reverently, made him uncomfortable, like feeding ghosts. That night, as the floodlights came on and the camp settled into a heavy quiet, Klaus pulled a small notebook from the lining of his jacket. The paper was creased, the pencil short as a matchstick. He wrote slowly, carefully, as if afraid the words might burn. "America feeds even its enemies." He paused, listening to the faraway hum of a generator, the murmurs from other barracks. Somewhere outside, a guard laughed. "I have eaten as a prisoner," he added, and remembered what it means to be human. He closed the notebook and hid it beneath the thin mattress. For the first time since Stalingrad, he felt the faint, unsteady pull of something he hadn't dared feel in years, the possibility that the world might still have room for forgiveness. In the distance, a train whistle cut through the night. Long, lonely, almost mournful. The prisoners lay awake, listening. None of them knew that these small moments, the eggs, the coffee, the uneasy kindness, would one day become part of the war's quietest story. A story not about guns or glory, but about the morning when the defeated were fed like men again. And for Sergeant Klaus Meyer, it began with breakfast. That night, under the yellow lights of Camp Hearne, he opened his eyes to the dark ceiling and thought, "If this is defeat, it is gentler than I imagined." He didn't know that the words he had written would survive him, that decades later, a U.S. Army archivist would read the faded line and pause, hand trembling slightly, before typing in the note. Document recovered from personal effects. POW expressed gratitude through written testimony. Unusual tone, sincerity beyond propaganda. The night ended quietly. But somewhere in that silence, a war-weary man had decided that the enemy could still be kind. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They called it Camp Hearn. But for the men behind its wire, it was something else. A mirror that showed them who they really were, stripped of orders, medals, and the iron certainty that had once held their world together. By autumn 1944, more than 4,000 German prisoners lived on those 400 acres of Texas soil. From the air, it looked like a small town. Neat rows of wooden barracks, a hospital, a post office, a laundry shed, and even a baseball field cut into the dry grass. Around it all, a double fence of barbed wire and 3 guard towers that glinted in the sun. The American guards called it the camp that built itself, because within weeks, the prisoners had organized everything. Workshops, a barber shop, even a small theater. One report from Captain James H. Whitman, who oversaw the facility, reads, "They are better organized than some of our own units. By Christmas, they'll have their own orchestra." He wasn't exaggerating. Inside Barrack 6B, Sergeant Klaus Meyer helped paint scenery for a play, a German comedy that none of the guards could understand but all came to watch. The prisoners had built the stage from scrap wood and flour sacks, strung up lights from old wiring, and even stitched uniforms from burlap. At night, the men sang quietly, voices rising above the hum of crickets. For a few moments, they weren't soldiers or captives. They were simply men trying to remember how to be alive. Private Joe Latham, the young American cook who had served them breakfast that first morning, sometimes lingered outside the wire just to listen. "They sound homesick," he said to another guard. The guard shrugged. "They should be. They're lucky they're not bones in France." Latham didn't answer. He just stared at the silhouettes of the prisoners in the lamplight. Men building furniture, playing chess, mending clothes. They looked ordinary. Inside, Meyer kept a careful distance from the more hardened officers. The camp was split into 2 invisible factions. On one side, the fanatics, men who still saluted the Führer's portrait before bed. On the other, those like Meyer, who no longer believed, who had begun to feel a dangerous sense of doubt. That divide grew sharper after an incident in early December. An American lieutenant entered a barrack and froze. On the wall hung 2 portraits, George Washington and Adolf Hitler, side by side. Beneath them, the caption in German read, "2 men who fought for their nations." The lieutenant called for the interpreter, asked them what the hell this means. One of the prisoners replied calmly, "It means we understand your respect for leadership, sir. We respect ours." The lieutenant stared, then said only, "Take it down." When the officers left, the prisoners replaced both pictures with a single empty frame. Nothing inside, just a border of wood and silence. That evening, Meyer wrote in his notebook, "We honor nothing now, only the space where belief once lived." A week later, something changed. During the Christmas service, the camp orchestra played Still Nacht. The sound drifted through the fences, soft and trembling. Guards stopped walking their rounds. One of them, a man from Ohio, took off his hat and said quietly, "That song's older than all of us." Meyer sang under his breath. The melody carried him back to his wife's kitchen in Dresden, to the smell of cinnamon and snow. When the song ended, he felt both heavier and lighter, as if the air itself had remembered something. In his next letter home, which would later be archived by U.S. Army censors, he wrote, "They do not treat us as beasts. I begin to feel ashamed of how we treated others." The letter never reached Dresden. The Allied bombings would erase that address 2 months later. Meanwhile, inside Camp Hearn, not everyone shared his awakening. One night, a captain from the Afrika Korps shouted during dinner, "They're poisoning our pride. These eggs, this music, it's a trap." He hurled his plate against the wall, yolk splattering across the wooden boards like a burst of color. For a second, the entire barrack went silent. Then another man quietly picked up the broken dish, cleaned the floor, and sat back down. No one spoke. Meyer looked around the table, faces lit by dim bulbs, men holding spoons like weapons they no longer knew how to use. He realized something that frightened him more than any battle ever had. The war was still inside them, and it didn't need rifles to keep fighting. The next day, Captain Whitman wrote in his daily log, "Discipline remains stable. Morale unpredictable. The Germans live between two worlds, one ending, one not yet begun." By New Year's Eve, the orchestra played again, this time for both prisoners and guards. The Americans stood outside the wire, listening. Someone clapped in rhythm. Someone else joined in. When midnight came, Meyer closed his eyes and whispered, "Let this year end quietly." It almost did, because for one long winter night, the camp held its breath. No gunfire, no shouting, no hatred. Just the sound of wind moving through barbed wire, humming like a tired prayer. Captain Whitman later wrote of that night, "It was the first peaceful Christmas since 1939. Then he added one more line, underlined in ink. But that silence will not last. Outside the fence, the world was still burning. And soon, the war would find its way back to them, not with bullets this time, but with something smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous. January 12, 1945. In the kitchen logbook of Camp Hearn, a line was added in tidy handwriting. 12 eggs unaccounted for. No one thought much of it. Not at first. But in a camp where dignity was the only thing left to protect, even 12 missing eggs could start a storm. That morning, the kitchen smelled faintly of grease and soap. Private Joe Latham was stacking crates when the supply officer shouted, "We're short." "Who counted these?" Latham flipped through the inventory sheets. The numbers didn't lie. 12 eggs gone, somewhere between the pantry and the prisoner's breakfast. Within hours, the rumor had spread through the barracks. The Germans stole from the Americans. By noon, every guard tower was on alert, and Captain Whitman himself came down from headquarters. He stood in the middle of the yard, the winter sun glinting off his glasses, and said evenly, "We'll find out who took them." The prisoners were assembled in lines, boots scraping the frozen dirt. Meyer stood among them, eyes down, the dry wind cutting across his face. He could feel the shame burning hotter than fear. They had fought in Stalingrad, in Africa, in France, and now they were accused of stealing breakfast. Inside the barracks, an interrogation began. The room was bare except for a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a dull pencil that scratched as Whitman took notes. "Sergeant Meyer," the interpreter said, "the Americans want to know, why would you risk it for eggs?" Meyer's voice was calm. "We didn't take them." "Then who did?" He hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't sound like defiance. "If someone did, perhaps they thought it was a gift. Because no one ever gave us one before." The interpreter blinked, unsure how to translate the quiet dignity of the sentence. When he did, Whitman simply stared at Meyer for a long moment before nodding to end the questioning. That night, the camp felt heavier. Men whispered in their bunks. Some cursed the Americans for suspicion, others cursed the unseen thief. The orchestra's instruments stayed silent. Even the guards moved more slowly, their boots crunching like distant echoes of some other war. But the truth, when it came, was stranger and smaller than anyone expected. 2 days later, Latham found an empty crate behind the mess tent. Inside was a piece of paper, folded twice. It read, "Didn't mean to start trouble. Was just testing them. J.L." Latham froze. Those were his own initials. But he hadn't written it. Someone else had taken his name, and his mistake. He went straight to Whitman, face pale. "Sir, I think it was one of ours. Someone took them as a joke." Whitman frowned. "A joke?" "Yes, sir. Wanted to see if the Krauts would break." The captain exhaled through his nose, then wrote a short report. Private Latham reprimanded for negligence. POWs cleared of wrongdoing. Incident closed. But for the prisoners, it wasn't so easily forgotten. When Meyer heard the result, he didn't speak. He simply returned to the mess hall, took his place in line, and accepted his tray. The guard on duty nodded at him, the smallest gesture of apology. That evening, as the camp lights dimmed, Meyer opened his notebook again. His hand shook slightly as he wrote, "The shame is not in being accused. It is in how much we feared losing their respect." He paused, then added another line. "They gave us breakfast. We gave them back our honesty." Outside, the night stretched wide and cold. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train rumbled, carrying new prisoners from the front. Meyer watched the floodlights sweep across the fence. For the first time, he noticed how the wire gleamed, not as a cage, but like a mirror, reflecting the men on both sides, equally tired, equally human. That night, before lights out, he wrote one last sentence. "If this is defeat, I do not wish victory." The next morning, the orchestra played again, quietly, while the guards listened from the other side of the fence. None of them knew that in 3 months' time, the war would end, and those same men would be sent back to a Germany that no longer existed. But on that January night, in a camp surrounded by barbed wire and kindness, Sergeant Klaus Meyer understood something that no bullet or uniform could erase. Sometimes the smallest acts, a meal, an apology, a misunderstanding made right, could be louder than all the guns of the world. And so, in his final note of that day, he wrote only 2 words, underlined twice. Human first. March 1945. The war in Europe was ending, or so they said. But at Camp Hearn, Texas, the mornings hadn't changed. The bell still rang, boots still shuffled toward the mess hall, and the smell of fried eggs still hung in the air. Only now, there was silence, the silence of letters that never arrived. Shurcht Baparu, Zvuk Pashtovich Imshikova. Every week, the prisoners lined up for mail call. Some received a postcard, some an empty envelope. That morning, Klaus Meyer was handed one bearing his wife's handwriting. His breath caught. He opened it carefully and found only a blank page. The words had been cut away by the censor's scissors. Across the crease, a purple stamp, Jeperft. He stared at the page as if it might confess something, then folded it once, twice, slid it into his pocket, and walked back to the barracks. That week, rumors changed shape. No longer about Allied landings or secret weapons, but about things no one wanted to believe. Guards whispered names across the fence. Buchenwald. Dachau. An American brought in a newspaper and read it aloud, the first reports of the camps. No one interrupted. No one moved. When he finished, there was only the sound of wind between the boards. That night, Meyer sat on his bunk, his small notebook open. His hands hovered, then began to tear a page, then another, slowly, not in anger, but as if silence were the only honest response. Halfway through, he stopped. The torn paper fluttered like a wounded bird. "If we knew," he whispered, "then we are guilty. If we didn't, maybe that's worse." He smoothed the fragments back together and closed the notebook. Daleki Shurcht Rada, Skrikt Nalashtovanya. Later that week, someone tuned a battered radio to the BBC. At first, static, then a clipped British voice, thin as wind. "Adolf Hitler is dead." Men looked at each other, waiting for someone to laugh, to deny it. No one did. One man crossed himself. Another let out a sound that might have been a sob. 2 days later, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. Guards and prisoners gathered in the yard. Captain Whitman unfolded a paper and read slowly. By order of the War Department, hostilities in Europe have ceased. Germany has surrendered. Chithiri sekundi fish. No one cheered. A few laughed, sharp, broken laughs that died as quickly as they came. One prisoner sat down in the dirt and put his head in his hands. Another simply whispered, "So that's it." Meyer stared at the ground. For years, everything he believed had been built on the idea of victory or death. Now, there was only survival, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. That night, the guards didn't patrol. The floodlights stayed off. Inside the mess hall, a few men gathered by the stove, watching the burner glow. Latham stood beside them, cap in hand. "It's over," he said quietly. "So what happens tomorrow?" "Same as today," someone replied. "Breakfast." Meyer watched as an egg cracked against the rim of a pan. The sound was too sharp, too clean. Later, in his notebook, he wrote, "If the world is forgiven, who forgives us?" Outside, rain began to fall, the first in weeks. The men stood in it, faces turned upward, unsure if it was punishment or blessing. In the days that followed, new papers appeared on the bulletin board, repatriation lists, transport orders. Men compared names like lottery numbers. No one smiled. At night, the barracks filled with whispers of home, of wives, children, ruins. The rumor of the camps lingered, heavier than any guard's command. On Sunday, the chaplain read a prayer for the dead of every nation. For the first time, no one objected. When dawn came again, the bell rang. The prisoners lined up. The kitchen hissed, and steamed. Latham ladled coffee, eyes red but steady. Meyer took his tray and sat in silence. He looked at the plate before him. The same breakfast as always, and felt nothing. The eggs still came in the morning, but no one could taste them anymore. October 1946. The war had been over a year, but the mornings at Camp Hearn still began with whistles, lists, and the clatter of trucks. This time, though, the trucks were pointed east. Repatriation. Names posted in block letters, numbers inked on tags, duffels lined like tired soldiers along the fence. The air smelled of dust and machine oil, and underneath it all, the nervous sweetness of train smoke drifting in from the siding. Klaus Meyer stood in line with a single bag and a folded blanket. He had cut the straps off his kit and stitched them back on twice. The canvas still remembered other roads. A clerk checked his tag, then waved him toward a table where Captain Whitman sat with a stack of papers and a small brown parcel wrapped in twine. "Sergeant Meyer," Whitman said, "before you go?" He pushed the parcel forward. Inside lay a thin booklet, mimeographed pages in English clipped to a lighter sheaf in German. The title page read, in tidy type, "Selections from the Diary of Sergeant Klaus Meyer, POW Camp Hearn, 1944-46. Below, a stamped line, "Translated for historical records, Fort Sam Houston." "We made a copy," Whitman said, lowering his voice. "For the archives. You keep the original. Consider this a receipt and a promise." Klaus turned a page. His own words looked unfamiliar in another alphabet. "America feeds even its enemies." Beneath, a translator's note. Context: first breakfast. He felt both gratitude and the old, stubborn heat of shame. "Why mine?" he asked. Whitman shrugged. "Because you wrote like you were watching history happen. And because not everyone did." By noon, the column moved. Handshakes. Thin smiles. Latham, older by a decade though 2 years had passed, found Klaus at the tailgate and held his hand too long. "You'll be all right," he said, sounding like a boy promising something he couldn't deliver. The convoy rolled south to the port. The ship smelled of salt, diesel, wet rope. On deck, the wind cut through coats and conversation. Men stood in clusters, phantoms in borrowed wool, staring at the American coast shrinking to a bruise on the horizon. Some sang quietly. Others watched the water as if it might return their lost words. Nights at sea were a library of creaks. In his bunk, Klaus read his own diary by a smear of light near the hatch. On the page with the breakfast entry, a stain had survived every wash and handling. A faint, round blot the color of old straw. He touched it with his thumb and felt a foolish tenderness, as if the yolk could still be warm. Hamburg met them with wind and cranes that swung above ruins like patient metronomes. The harbor water was a gray mirror. The city beyond it was teeth and gaps. Zollvereinsstrasse, gone. Holstenster, roofless. The clerk at the reception shed stamped papers without looking up. Next, next. Outside, children in coats 2 sizes too big sifted rubble with spoons, hunting anything that glittered. A woman offered a wedding ring for a sack of potatoes and found no takers. On a tram that rattled through streets mapped by absence, Klaus saw a familiar profile at the far end. Sharp jaw, desert tan gone sallow. The former Africa Corps captain who had once thrown a plate in the barack stood gripping the strap, eyes fixed past the driver. Their gazes met. The man smiled without humor. "They broke us with kindness," he said when they stepped off at the same stop, speaking as if continuing a conversation left mid-sentence in Texas. "You know that, Meyer? Not with sticks. With eggs." He laughed once, a short, cracked sound. "I think about that more than I think about El Alamein." "They didn't break me," Klaus said. "They put me back together." "Same result," the captain replied, and was gone. The road to Dresden was a museum of roofs in the snow. At each stop, fewer houses stood. At each bridge, more sky showed through. He walked the last kilometers, the parcel under his coat, the diary pressed flat against his ribs. Where his street should have been was a field of frost-covered bricks studded with chimneys like gravestones. He found her name at a relief center. Meyer, Margaret, refugee. The clerk pointed to a barracks of rough wood on the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled of damp and potatoes. She sat on a bunk near a pot of water not yet boiling. Thinner, hair shorn. The face he knew altered by all the days he had not seen. They stared first, then closed the distance awkwardly and held on. When the hands let go, the questions arrived in a rush, dying before they finished. He told her what he could. She told him less. Some words don't cross certain thresholds. He showed her the translated booklet, the stamped line, the American promise. They gave us eggs, he said, realizing too late how strange it sounded here, in a room where soup was thin and spoons dented. Eggs. She tried to smile and failed. For prisoners? You must be lying to make me feel less poor. He didn't argue. He pulled the original diary from his coat and opened to the page with the round blot. Look, he said, absurdly gentle, as if speaking to the mark itself. It wouldn't wash out. She touched the stain as if it might sting. Her eyes filled fast and angry. How can you tell me about kindness when everything kind burned? She swallowed, looked at his hands. I'm glad you ate, she added after a long breath, and the words cut more than if she had not. That night, he slept on boards beside her bunk, the diary under his jacket as a shield against dreams. Wind found seams in the walls and made the room breathe. Somewhere outside, a bicycle bell rang twice, once for caution, once for nothing at all. In the morning, he stood in a queue for ration cards and watched a man barter his cufflinks for a loaf. The captain's sentence returned, unwelcome and exact. They broke us with kindness. He tasted it like metal. By week's end, he registered with the city, found a day's labor moving brick to brick, began to measure time by the distance between open palms. In the evenings, he copied his diary into a second notebook in a smaller hand, pages meant for someone he could not yet name. Tell your soldiers, he wrote once and crossed it out. When winter settled, he wrapped the original in a strip of oilcloth and slid it into a drawer he had planed smooth himself. For the archives, Whitman had said, as if time were a building with shelves. Klaus closed the drawer and felt, for the first time since the ship, that something might survive him. He realized, the war had ended, but the shame had just begun. And shame, like hunger, teaches its own posture. Years later, a metal drawer in Texas would open with a hollow sound. But before that could happen, before anyone who had not stood at that fence could read what a man had written between meals and memories, someone would have to find the name Meyer again and decide it still mattered. 1984, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. In a forgotten cabinet of Army archives, an archivist named Evelyn Price opened a gray box that hadn't been touched in decades. Inside lay a thin notebook wrapped in brown paper. The first line, written in careful German handwriting, read, "America feeds even its enemies." The ink had faded, but someone had circled the sentence twice, as if to make sure time couldn't erase it. Evelyn turned the brittle pages. The entries were small, exact, written in pencil that had smudged along the edges. Each page carried the same quiet rhythm: morning rolls, work details, the strange kindness of hot food. Some pages were stained. She rubbed her thumb over a yellow mark that looked like dried yolk and realized it was exactly that. The writer had been a prisoner, but his tone was not bitter. It was searching. A note slipped between the pages read, Diary of Sergeant Klaus Meyer, POW Camp Hearn, Texas, 1944-46. Translated 1946 by U.S. Army Intelligence. Evelyn had cataloged thousands of documents, but this one felt different. It was human. One passage caught her completely. They fed us before they forgave us. Maybe that's the right order. She sat back, staring at the words, feeling the quiet weight of them. Mercy described not as a feeling, but as an act. Later that evening, she searched the records for his name. There was a file from 1946 with a last address, Hamburg. Out of curiosity, she called a contact at the German embassy. Days passed. Then the phone rang. The operator transferred her call. A man's voice came through, soft and deliberate, with the roughness of age. This is Meyer. She explained who she was, how she'd found his diary. There was a pause, then a slow breath. You've been reading my younger self, he said. I almost don't remember him. Evelyn asked if he remembered Camp Hearn. Yes, he said. The fences, the heat, and the breakfast. Real eggs. I still think about them. He laughed faintly. They changed what I thought mercy meant. They spoke for 10 minutes. He told her he had remarried, that his first wife hadn't survived the hunger after the war, that he still kept a copy of the diary, the original pages gone soft from handling. When she asked if she could quote him for the record, he said, "No one needs to quote me. Just remember that kindness outlives everything else." Then the line went silent. The next day, Evelyn filed the notebook properly. She labeled it Camp Hearn Collection, TX, HR, 17, Meyer, Klaus. She wrote a short note for the record, primary source detailing humane treatment of German POWs and the moral reconciliation of post-war identity. But when she finished, she didn't immediately close the box. She kept reading. The final entry in the diary was dated April 1946. "If they ask what I learned here, tell them, mercy doesn't belong to the victors. It belongs to whoever chooses it first." That night, Evelyn drove to Hearn. The old camp was gone, replaced by grass, a few concrete foundations, and a rusted gate still standing against the wind. She stood where the kitchen had once been. The field was silent, but somehow she could imagine the clatter of plates, men speaking German and English, and the smell of breakfast that had once carried across the fences. Back in her office, she filed the diary away in its drawer and closed it gently. The metal clicked shut with a hollow sound, as if the archive itself were exhaling. Across the ocean, in Hamburg, Klaus Meyer sat by his window with a pen and a blank page. His handwriting was slower now, but steady. He began a letter addressed to the American archivist. "Tell your soldiers," he wrote, "that they made me human again." He signed his name carefully, folded the letter, and left it on the table beside a small pan cooling on the stove. The smell of fried eggs still lingered in the room, faint but real, like something rescued from another lifetime. Some wars end with surrender. Others end with breakfast.